I read because in the last 20 years, over 6 million Americans have dropped out of high school. That will not be me.
50% of adults in the U.S. can't read 8th grade level books. That will not be me.
I read because 2/3 of students who cannot read by the 4th grade fluently will end up in jail or on welfare, and that will not be me.
Because if 70% of the adults have not been in a bookstore in the last 5 years, that will not be me.
1/3 of high school students will not read another book after they graduate. That will not be me.
I read because 80% of U.S. families did not buy or read a book last year. That will not be my family.
46% of Americans can't understand the label on their prescription bottles. That will not be me.
Most American teenagers spend 2 hours watching TV every day and only 7 minutes of reading. That will not be me.
I read because 42% of college graduates will never read another book after graduation. That will not be me.
I read because 25% of American children's educations are put at risk because they cannot read proficiently enough. That will not be me.
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 That will not be me. I read because I refuse to become a statistic.
Reading will make you great. We will be great.
I read books.
I read books.
I read books.
I read textbooks. I read books, fiction and nonfiction.
I read board books.
I read fiction books.
I read leadership books.
I read banned books.
I read the newspaper.
I read the Camas Post-Record.
I read historical fiction.
I read magazines.
I read the Camas High School Daily Bulletin.
I read everything.
I read spreadsheets.
I read poetry.
I read middle school novels from our library.
I read music notes.
I read Harry Potter.
I read articles.
I read children's books.
I read nonfiction.
I read Ann Patchett.
I read travel magazines.
I read blogs.
One thing I like to read a lot is historical books, especially local history about Camas, Washougal, Clark County, things like that.
I read student projects.
I read text messages from my daughter.
I read trade journals.
I read a lot of emails and professional literature.
I read young adult lit because I like to know what the kids are reading and I can talk to them in the hallway and in the library.
I read out loud because it's never too soon to listen to a good story.
I read the Bible and I read it because I want to learn from what happened in the past.
I read board books because that's how I get my kids to sit on my lap and snuggle with me.
I read the weather so I know what to wear that day. I read because it's fun.
I read because it's amazing!
I read because I like to know what's going on at Camas High School, and it gives me the chance to say, "Go Papermakers!"
We read because cheerleaders are smart!
I read everything because one life isn't enough. One lifetime isn't enough.
I read because I get paid.
I read to keep up with all of our principals and to stay in touch with what's going on in education.
Because they could learn how to write their own sentence.
I read because I have to. It is just a part of my life.
I got this read imagination.
I read because I enjoy learning about the many amazing accomplishments of the students and staff of the Camas School District.
I read my opponent so I'm goal-oriented.
Because they can build letters on the socks.
I read because I edit the newspaper. I read for fun.
I read because I like to know what my students are doing, and I appreciate what I can learn from them.
I like to read because I want to learn how to cook.
I read because I love to learn.
I read to keep in touch.
I read because I like adventure.
I read to be great.
I want to read to learn to spell better.
I read because life is too short and it's hard to see everything in the world, so I love opening my mind to other things that are going on in this great world of ours.
I read banned books because everyone should have the freedom to read a book of their choice.
I read because I like to be informed.
I read because I have to.
I read because I'm college bound.
I read because I'm a dedicated Harry Potter fan.
I read because I like to travel and I want to be informed of where I am traveling.
Because I really want to learn and how to write letters.
I read because it's an excellent way to get new information about things you're interested in.
I read because I want to stay connected.
I read because it's relaxing, it takes me to another place in the world, so it's de-stressing and it's enjoyable.
I read because I want to learn from the experience of others.
I read because it stretches my mind.
I read because I like to escape into the literature.
I read to gain knowledge in my field of study.
Because I like reading.
I read because I love history.
I read because it gets the brain going.
I read because I'm an AP student.
I read because it's fun and entertaining.
I read because I like to read to my daughters.
You know, the more that you read, the more things you will know. And the more that you learn, the more places you'll go.